That was relatively brief. I have to give you an updated version of it. Okay, thank you all for coming out. And actually, there are more copies of the handout if anyone needs them. I don't know, maybe go to the end of the tables. Some of you heard me talk in the fall as part of the Linguistics Colloquium series. If so, I apologize because the first part, to give you some context, will be somewhat of a repetition, including the first item on the handout, which is the key to what started me on this project. And it actually goes back to the Humanities Center Syntax Semantics workshop. Humanities Center supported syntax semantics workshop. There's room up here, Robert, if you want to sit.
That close my call on me.
I'll scoot down here a little bit now that there's a whole table. Grab my coffee. I was presenting a paper on cognitive linguistics at the syntax semantics workshop. Some of you were there. And one of the things I explained was that a tenet of cognitive linguistics, as founded by Ron Laneker and George Lakoff and various people in Europe, is that syntax is symbolic of meaning. That you don't have the divide that you find in other kinds of linguistics where there's structure here and there are various ways in which it's connected to meaning, but not quite as directly in many of the cases as saying, as Laneker says, and I gave you the quote as item 1 in the handout, claim that the lexicon, morphology, and syntax form a continuum of symbolic units serving to structure conceptual content for expressive purposes. It is incoherent to speak of grammar in isolation of meaning. And Laneker goes further in some other quotes and uses the term syntax is symbolic of meaning. And what happened in discussion that day is that Liliana and a couple of other colleagues, Nick, who isn't here anymore, said to me, is that always true? Is the claim that it's always true? And I have been poking at that question ever since. It's become a kind of framework for a lot of the research that I've been doing, a lot of the thinking I've been doing. The example I gave you in your handout is one of Laneker's in his very first Foundations of Cognitive Linguistics, and that one is, at the time, in the late 80s, it was staking a claim, let me put it that way, so that saying that he gave the book to Mary and he gave Mary the book weren't just variations, meaningless variations, and saying, no, if you take focus, if you take what the stress is on either Mary or the book into account as part of meaning, then indeed these are different meanings with coming out of the order of the words. So that's where I started. And I have spent the last couple of years on and off, as I have time to do it, thinking about what would be evidence for meaningless syntax. And one of the things I came up with fairly recently was to go back to some work done in the early 90s, first by Roger Lass, who is a historical phonologist, mostly, though he works generally in historical linguistics, and then taken up by some other people. And the backside of the handout is the bibliography of what I cite. Roger Lass's paper of 1990 starts by saying it's generally a bad idea to take concepts and constructs from one field of investigation and transfer them to another. It normally doesn't work. Those of you who know Roger Lass knows that he is in some ways, or was, he's quieting down now, a somewhat larger-than-life presenter and writer. So he started with, this is a bad idea, but I'm going to do it anyway, because I think it works in this case. And what he did was look at some work by Stephen Jay Gould, an evolutionary biologist, and Elizabeth Verba. And I've given you the reference there also, where they invent a term to, well, let me give you the term and then I'll define it. The term is exaptation. And it's based on the idea that in evolutionary time, you will have, I'll use the word structure, but understand that as not having a technical meaning, but just a way of talking about things that hold together. You will have structures that lose their purpose, lose their utility, and then sometime, but don't disappear as structures, and sometime later are repurposed, used for something else. And Lass suggests, and this is what they call, what Gould and Verba and then Lass call exaptation. That is the use of what was junk. Gould and Verba talk about junk DNA, and I haven't done a huge amount of reading in this, but it's a term, when I've talked about this with people in almost any area, discipline who know anything about it, they say, oh yes, junk DNA. So it's a term that's held on. The exaptation then is the repurposing, the reuse of something that has lost its use for some other purpose. And Lass suggests, and that's where I was going with this, that we can look at linguistic change that way. There are certain kinds of linguistic change that might indeed benefit by being thought of as and labeled as exaptive. I assume that's the adjective for it. I don't think I've ever said it out loud or heard it before, but it'll do. The example that Lass provides, the first example of two that he provides in his article, and I should say that with a little patience about the history, about great details in the history of Germanic, it's a very accessible article, and available through JSTOR. The example he provides that I'll cite as the first example with some real data, or anyway a real structure to be looked at, is the history of adjectives in Afrikaans. Afrikaans is a close relative of Dutch, spoken in South Africa. It is therefore a West Germanic language. We go by, I'm going at this genealogically and not by geography. It's a colonial language. In Germanic, and some of you know German or Yiddish, those are good examples, English and Dutch are not, you have a case system. That is, there are endings somewhere in a noun, in a nominal expression, that change depending on whether you've got the subject of a sentence or the direct object of the sentence, or of a clause, direct object, indirect object. Germanic never had a very elaborate case system, especially if you compare it to Finnish, which has something like 16 different case endings. But it had in Old Germanic and in modern German and Yiddish, you have a case system. Interestingly, it moved mostly in both those languages from being noun endings to being adjective endings. So it's in phrases that have adjectives, it's usually the adjective that has more information on it. In Dutch, in Afrikaans, the case system disappears. However, what you have left is, oh good, another linguist. what you have left is that you've got endings on the adjectives that stay behind. So that in Afrikaans, like modern Dutch, you have adjectives where there's no ending, and you have adjectives that end, and I'll use the letter E to describe it. It's a schwa probably, however, in those languages where you don't mark case, you use word order, they no longer, they have become, in this sense that Lass is talking about, they've become junk. They're not doing what they etymologically, historically, were doing before, because the whole system has shifted around them. In Afrikaans, what you get instead is the use of the zero ending or the schwa, the as indicators of adjective classes. So some adjectives have zero all the time, others have this all the time. And the point Lass is making is that what was a syntactic marker, is it a subject, is it an object, is it whatever else was marked by the object of a preposition, has now become a morphological adjective class ending instead. So that's the good, robust example that, if you buy it, that Lass gives you. I went on and looked at some other work and tried working on, coming up with other examples of what might be called junk, partly inspired by work by John Charles Smith, who's a Romanist at Oxford. And one of the things that he suggests, and I can see the argument for, is that, again, I'll stick to case, I don't want to get over elaborate on this. Latin had a somewhat more complicated case system than Germanic, not much, doesn't rise to the level of 16 different cases, it's only 5, but that gives it one more than Germanic. They disappear, except, and this is a long story for another time, in Romanian, but that's sort of irrelevant here. What you get instead in French, I'll give you the examples from French, there are a lot in Italian also, is series of doublets. That is, words that come from a single etymological source or variations on a single etymological source, but have split one way or another. And the standard French examples are some nouns, and I gave you on your handout, skip and for a second, because that's the most interesting of them. Chantre is a cantor in the religious sense, or a choir master, comes from the subject case in Latin, while chanteur, generic meaning a singer, masculine, comes from the object case. In the same way, copain, which means a pal, or a companion, basically a pal, it's a, not colloquial, but it's an informal word, compared to compagnon, coming from the object case. Copain comes from the subject case, meaning more formally a companion. And then compagnon has pretty much the same weight, strength, nuance that English companion does. Copain really is pal. So you've got in both of these cases, in both of these instances, case disappears, you've got semantic splits instead. Not very distant semantic splits. You still have nouns. And the nouns are not terribly far apart in meaning. You can see where a cantor is an instance of a kind of singer. Copain, chanteur, compagnon, you get social variation. Is more interesting in that from Latin homo, masculine noun meaning man, subject case, becomes a pronoun. It's the indefinite pronoun, while hominem, object case, stays as the noun and is the generic man. Just tiny anecdote having nothing to do with French or Latin, but having to do with development here. At least in southern Illinois, I have new speakers. Jeff and I were talking about this last night, who instead of saying something as formal as one could do such and such, said a person could do, which brings you all the way back again to the etymological, it's not etymological, it's just a reinvention of the same metaphor, but using a person as the indefinite. He was our handyman, and the joke was that every time Barry said a person could, the price doubled. But that was his indefinite. Okay, so it gives you a sense of a couple of fairly robust examples of what might be repurposing of junk. The third one I have in here, because J.C. Charles Smith talks about it. I'm not sure this is junk or a warning that the term can be overused, which is that because you have phonological changes very much involved here, and it maybe we just want to say this is normal change, except there's repurposing at the end. Latin personal pronouns, there was one set. I'm sticking to mostly to first and second person because it gets complicated beyond that, though I'll talk about it for a minute. With, again, subject, in possessive, indirect object, direct object, object of preposition. So you have all the cases with different endings, or some of them have markedly different endings. In modern French, you have remains of the object case mostly, but because of phonological change conditioned by stress, and I mean phonological stress, you get double development. So you get m, which comes from Latin me, where there's no stress, and moi, which comes from Latin me, where the word is stressed in the sentence. No, I'm sorry, where the vowel is stressed. And as I used to threaten my history of French courses, if you really want all the development between a and wa, I'll be glad to do it, but to answer a question. It's a kind of repurposing, because what happens is that in modern French you have two series of pronouns. You have the unstressed ones. Object comes before the verb. He, me, sees. Il me voit. Or you can have a stressed one. He sees me. Il me voit moi. So you've got a whole different purpose for one set of pronouns. It gets quite a bit complicated when you get to the third person, because they don't come from Latin unstressed pronouns. They come from Latin demonstratives. And in fact, they come from all over the place. So the stressed in the third person singular, the lui, comes from the dative in Latin, the indirect object. The in the plural, il with an S on the end of it, comes from the possessive plural. It's refurbished all over the place. And then you have some like the first person plural, nous, where the stress form is exactly the same as the unstressed form. And if syntax reigns again, you know it's stressed because of where it is in the sentence. So you've got here a complex case where I have question marks all over my notes about, is this really repurposing of junk? Well, maybe for the stress, unstressed, where they are phonologically regular, but then all kinds of other things come into it by parallelism to the ones that are etymologically sounder as an argument. I think we're at the verge here of what Lass says fairly early in his article, where he says you have to watch out, not everything is exaptation. if you say everything is acceptation, you don't need a new term, it's just language change. So I've given you one of Lass's examples, so you have it from the horse's mouth. One that I think you can still argue is exaptive, and one where it starts going over the edge. What do we make of this? What's the point here in terms of my original question, which is junk a source of meaninglessness? And I'll start with a couple of serious doubts about it, and it occurs to me I have them on this piece of paper. And then go on to a couple of broader matters. My first question, and it's one I've had since I first started hearing about acceptation, is, does language ever become meaningless? Can you really say, as seems to be the case with DNA, that something lurks below the surface, but it's not really being purposeful now? There's a quote at the end of what I have to say that addresses this from a very philosophical point of view. But think about the fact that when we talk about language change, we talk about change coming from variation, which means that we have always the sense that there is, use Martinet's term, dynamic synchrony, that there's always movement in the synchrony. It's not that something stops and then something else begins. You can't do that. There's a paper that came out a long time ago. I'm looking at Martha because she's the one here who's, if anyone here knows it, she's the most likely, called the layer cake model of language, of linguistics, by a man named Itzo. Do you know it? No. In which he argues vehemently against strata as layer cake model, on the ground that you can't talk about one layer on top of another, as if there's a divide and you see where the layers are. You have to talk about periods of mixture to get to change. And I would make the argument that that's the problem here also. That if you talk about linguistic junk, you're talking about sharp divides. And that goes against most of what we know about language change. So I see that as a problem to begin with. Another problem is that you get, again, lots of repurposing when this goes back to variation and variation resolving itself. The kind of example that we use in basic linguistics, like elder and older, where yes, we have both of those etymologically. I'm not sure they're doublets or what, but elder is the etymological form. It was regularized as older. And elder becomes specialized for certain things. So we talk about church elders, if we do at all. We talk about the slightly, I think, old-fashioned, an elder brother and elder sister instead of older. But it's a very narrow use of the word, and older has become the standard comparative of old. There's lots of that going on. I'm not sure that we can talk about any point again where there was junk, where elder stopped being the term, but older hadn't come in yet. And then elder came back again with a specialized term. I find it very hard to conceptualize it that way. And the third piece of sort of language history thoughts about what's wrong with junk is that, to use a phrase that I got from Jeff, language abhors a synonym in the sense of a true synonym. People look for ways of making sense of what look like synonyms. And this would be part of what goes on in dynamic synchrony, dynamic variation. So that, for example, there are two pronunciations of the vessel for holding flowers, vase and vase. They're not geographic. I don't think they're social. They're not social in my dialect. But I'm going to ask you because I never remember which is which.
Well, I'm just quoting Bill LeBeouf.
Yes,
Who
well,
claims that he has found students who believe that vases are small and cheap and vases are large and expensive.
I would maintain that that's fine. And after the fact, imposition, I mean, my favorite one, some of you have heard this before, is I had a student when I was doing baby morphology once and talking about the fact that the verb to dive is one of the rare ones that has evolved from a 19th century regular verb to a 20th century irregular past tense, 20th and on. And one of my students, whom I can still name and picture, said to me, oh no, dive, yeah. And I said something like, but there are still people who said dived, who say dived rather than dove. And my student looked at me and said, oh no, they have different meanings. And I never remember which is which, but one has to do with self-propulsion and the other one has to do with being caused to submerge in water. People look for synonyms the same way people find, but the same way sometimes one of the synonyms like elder, older will be narrowed, all in periods of variation. And if this is where I have my biggest problems with the whole idea of junk and the idea that, again, that you find meaninglessness. I found support, and that's your last quote in the big quote under 3, in a paper by someone who is, on the whole, mostly a formalist, Nigel Vinson. Martha probably knows him or has met him. On the nature of language. And it's worth reading out loud, at least part of it. The notion of linguistic junk is not coherent because languages are sign systems and no part of a sign system is without function, even if we as analysts have not worked out what the function in question is. Furthermore, since the scientific endeavor is never complete, one can never be sure if there is not a generalization still lurking out there, waiting to be captured, which will encompass just the piece of linguistic form that has heretofore been written off as junk. Couple of points there, some of which are relevant, some aren't. I mean, obviously science keeps marching on. So I'm not terribly taken with the idea that eventually we'll figure it all out. I think we all agree on that one. But the first part of the quote I found interesting because it led me to another thought pattern, which I'll try out on you, which is that I wonder if this question of meaninglessness is one that can be approached by saying there can be synchronic meaninglessness, maybe, but not diachronic. And this is where I get into dynamic. Actually, I've just argued myself out of it by thinking, no, if we say synchrony is dynamic, then it's not even a good thought. But the idea that you may have some little corners where people haven't yet gone to cleaning up what they see as synonyms and want to fix into different meanings, or frozen expressions, and frozen expressions is something I want to look at still. I'll try one, is by and large. I mean, no, because it has meaning. It's just not the etymological meaning. What do you do with certain things like that? French has one verb that uses a particle to mean where the base verb is aller, to go, and to go away is s'en aller. It's reciprocal or pronominal, and it has this en. Etymologically, it's easy to make a point that on comes from it, away from. But synchronically, people don't know that. And this is the one, in fact, in an argument at a conference once with J.C. Smith, he brought up as, well, how do you make sense of that? And this is part of what leads me to wonder if there are tiny corners that are frozen. Perhaps the way of thinking of it as seen as part of a whole where once they were syntax. But I'm not sure that that makes them any less meaningful. This is what I've been thinking about in terms of junk. I have, in my own mind, pretty much decided that it was an idea worth exploring, but it doesn't work. And that I have to look elsewhere if I'm looking for meaningless elements, if there are any. But I'd like now just to thank you people who nodded at a couple of my points, that's always helpful. But see what you all think about this. Those of there are many in this room who have thought a lot about language from many different directions. Let me just, for people who haven't heard me before, or haven't heard me talk about this before, say that when I talk about meaning under cognitive linguistics, and this I don't question at all, it's a very broad, inclusive sense of what meaning is, covering what in some other theories might be divided out as this is pragmatics, this is semantics. I'm talking about something global there. And with that, I'll stop and find out what your ideas are. Thank you for listening. Stephen.
Okay. I have a million things, so I'm going to just pick one.
But we will talk later about the 999
We will.
left.
A lot of what you, I like the fact that you raised your student who had two different meanings for dived and dove, and I think similarly, vase and vase is these are parallel in part because when we look at the question of junk, we have to start at that individual level if we're going to take a serious cognitive linguistic look and say, junk for whom and junk in what way? So for instance, vase and vase, I mean, for me, I think there are actually geographical. I know it's Burnett who's done some work on vase vase, which has an isogloss at the Maine, New Brunswick border.
Really?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Because, of course, vase is a more French-influenced pronunciation. And when you find, it doesn't surprise me at all that you'd find American students who find that good old American vase being the cheap, tacky one, and the French vase being the elite.
I'm a New Yorker, and it's always been vase, even before I knew French.
That's interesting. It would be interesting to know whether there's some diachronicity there too, which is not a way of suggesting that you're old, Margaret. That's not it. But it's a way to explore how does this variation, which exists at the idiolectal level, the individual level, become something more than that, become purposed into something that we would call structural or systemic. And there, I think the fact that you're starting with Afrikaans, where you have contact language phenomena, where you have second language phenomena going on, is quite relevant, because I think it's exactly at those interstices between where you don't have a clear phylogenetic descent, where you have all of these other phenomena, where you're likely to see junk-like phenomena becoming more relevant. And I guess I'm looking at your case doublets, and I'm from Latin, and I'm wondering, what's the origin of those? Are those existing as contact phenomena in some way, or as second language phenomena, or do these just sort of emerge gradually?
I think they emerge gradually. Yeah. There's a wonderful poem by François Villon, 16th century, early 16th century, no, 15th century, who writes a poem in the old mode and gets all the cases wrong. It's, I mean, I read it, I think, when I did French Lit, but the important part for me even then was he doesn't know the old French case system.
Yeah.
And he's aiming at it. So I think that you've got, it's not just contact phenomena, unless you.
No, and I don't think just, but for me, it would be that question of, okay, how are people actually conceptualizing this variation? You saw this very poignantly this week, as those of us who speak a lot of French see a phrase like "Je suis Charlie" and understand that as polysemous. Is it "I am Charlie" or is it "I follow Charlie"?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And those of us who know just a little French, we just know that might say, well, it's just "I'm Charlie," and you find all kinds of American news saying, oh, that just means "I'm Charlie," and so that kind of variation sort of exists at an individual level, and so that's not quite junk, because I think suis, those are not cognate. The two suis are different suis. But
and essay.
Yeah, but they're the same sort of individual process that sort of leads to some reflection, that leads to some reconceptualization, and then the question is, how does that get into a community in a way that we would then describe as a linguistic phenomenon that transcends the individual?
Of course, that's the question we ask over. That's the question of how do you get from actuation to spread.
Right.
And it pervades anything you do in a historical mode. But I think you're absolutely right that one of the interesting questions is there something specific about it when you're looking at this kind of change? I think you can put too much emphasis on these chanteur, chanteur kind of thing. Also, but I don't know if anyone has really looked a whole lot at finding synonyms where synonyms weren't there before. I don't know of anything on that, but I think that would make an interesting study in itself. As a kind of repurposing. Ellen.
Margaret, I was wondering if there are any studies of junk syntax and acquisition to see whether.
In what, sorry?
In language acquisition, acquisition of syntax in particular, to see, how, to see whether that has any bearing on whether.
That's an interesting, I hadn't thought of it.
Junk doesn't start as non-junk or something like that.
Thank you, because I hadn't thought about that. Now you see, I meant to bring one and forgot. Liliana.
Yes, I really kind of like this idea of acceptation, and I'm thinking the way I understand it in biology is that you don't have to wait until something becomes junk. You can have acceptation even with something that is still in use, and sometimes overlapping between the old use and the new use. And things can be gradual, I think. So I think that may not be such a problem for the linguistic junk. But I'm also thinking about grammaticalization as possibly one example where you're not waiting for something to become junk, but you are, well, not repurposing, but purposing it also for something else. I don't know what that word would be. So you're not completely losing the old purpose, but you're giving it another purpose. So maybe something like auxiliary verbs like have, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have seen that. So they have been grammaticalized from the verb to have, but we still use have to mean possess. there, you know, there is a possibility that you can develop another purpose while still overlapping, keeping the old purpose. And in some cases you can lose the old purpose. But I think the timing doesn't necessarily have to be you lose one purpose and then you treat it as junk, and then the junk then possibly acquires a new function. I think that gives you a lot more flexibility with what you can say with respect to acceptation.
It definitely does, but then it goes back to what, remember I said that Lass had said you don't want to use acceptation for everything.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, certainly grammaticalization, and the verb to have, you know, the whole Romance future is based in most of the Romance languages on a grammaticalization of to have, and yet the verb stays in several of the languages, not in Spanish though. They take the verb to hold, and that becomes the possession verb instead. In most ways, have becomes an auxiliary either of the future where it's been lost, people don't know it's the future, it comes from that, or the perfect, where it's still the verb to have, and that's about the only place it shows up, I think. But the danger is if we just say, well, anything can be repurposed, then we don't, Lass in full linguistics at least, says very specifically, we have to keep this narrow. And he holds on to the idea that it has gone to junk and reemerged. I mean, otherwise, you know, practically the history of any language, and I don't mean that to trivialize what you said. What you said is important. And goes back, I think it was what I was trying to say about there have to be periods of variation, periods of coexistence.
Overlap.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And the coexistence can be coexistence of double use of to have as an auxiliary, as a full verb, as well as different using, you know, different pronunciations of vase and vase. We have to look that one up, Stephen. Martha.
So the challenge is to find an example in some modern language where there is something that everyone will recognize as meaningless.
I start with one example, yes.
Yes. Yeah, and of course, things like the sonnet, it's become codified and frozen, and so that doesn't count because that's now meaningful in itself. So you have to look for variation where a difference of meaning has not yet evolved. It's just pure variation, meaningless variation. Is that the kind of example that you're looking for?
Meaningless variation would be one way, and it may be the most robust way of finding it because you can test it against something that's the meaningful in the meaning. But I think the other point is the sonnet type, where there's simply meaningless stuff without it necessarily being variation. Nobody uses, conveys to go away in modern French without using the on.
Right, but it almost has become lexicalized.
Oh, yeah.
Right, so.
And in fact it wasn't, it was productive in Old French.
Right.
So you have sans venir, for example.
But I'm thinking, one thing that has always bothered me in English that seems to be meaningless, people have told me that they can make sense of it, but I've never been able to make sense of it, is the old adverbial s suffix on certain directionals, so toward and towards, for example. And I can use both toward and towards in exactly the same context. Backward and backwards, I have a slight, slight inclination to use one of them in certain contexts and the other in certain other contexts, but toward and towards, I have to invent an explanation for that one in modern English.
Well, backward is the adverbial, but toward is a preposition. No?
Words,
I mean,
I can use them,
yeah.
I can't find a context where one sounds good and the other sounds bad.
Because backward and backwards, I have
Yeah,
very strong feeling about difference.
right.
Uh,
It's clearly not a productive suffix, but yet it has not either disappeared or won out.
It's
So it
very
feels very
slightly
junky to me.
productive. Well, word is very slightly productive.
Pardon me?
Word is very slightly productive. All right, it was productive in the 19th century.
What are
At
you
once I-
thinking of?
I'm thinking of the line from Mikado, "At once I go Mikado wards."
mhm.
I mean, clearly they were making a joke, but on the other hand, they couldn't have made the joke if people didn't see it at all.
I think it would still be a perfectly good joke. We're going Paris words.
But the S thing is.
But the S thing is
nice
real,
and
yeah.
simple.
Yeah.
I have a question. Does something have to be meaningless or just wrong?
Or what?
Like ungrammatical, so,
Meaningless.
Cause, I just got to see you talk, but they're talking about they were just not having the right, something in subject position, and so the adults were saying this is just wrong, there's something missing. I don't even know how to look at this, where the kids are like, oh no, this is how to say this now. So, I mean, you could get a reading from the adults it's meaningless even. because-
Well, that's not wrong then. I mean, then you've got generational differences. There was one I wrote down, I have an awful feeling it was Robert who said it. It had to do with biking.
Yeah, I ride my bike sometimes.
Yes, I know, but it was something you said,
Oh,
not,
I don't remember
not
that.
riding your bike. It was bike with a preposition, and I've got it written in my notes somewhere, and I thought of it I didn't call
Yeah.
attention to it and
Yeah.
point my finger and say, you just said something odd, but, I've seen that happen. But it's the addition of a preposition where I had I stared at it for a while, I'll have to find this and then send it to you. But you're raising another very good point, which is that, and it goes back in a sense to Stevens, which is one person's junk is another person's meaningful element. And you've given us a good example of where the variation can be, which is generational. Kevin?
Just on that last one, bike, I'm thinking, isn't there a variation in French of I'm biking versus I'm going on bike too? I just read that last week somewhere.
Je roule à bicyclette, there's no verb to bike.
Okay. But as far as,
That I can think of.
I was thinking last
So
week I
then
made
tell me
beef
that you
stock.
can't have.
And I threw the bones in the oven and they're in the roasting pan, and I pull the roasting pan out, pull everything out of the pan, throw it in the stock pot. And there's a bunch of junk in the pan that you keep. But when I make a steak and there's similarly looking stuff in the pan, I throw palm oil on it and throw it down the drain. So I'm just, all of it gets thrown out eventually, but when you taste the final stock, you know it's not there, or you know it is there because the foam.
Well, that might be rhetorical. I'm trying to bring it back to language.
But just,
I'll have to think
just
about
the
that one.
motivations for keeping in certain environments but not in other
Yeah,
environments.
mhm.
I think that's very interesting. As far as looking at acceptation, I just want to bring that up.
You were,
I had a question, I guess not as a linguist, but it really kind of wondered if what you were talking about is, I was thinking of the poem from Lewis Carroll, Beware of the Jabberwock. And I couldn't help but thinking of this idea that it's nonsense, but there is something being said in that poem, but you can't exactly put your finger on what they're talking about.
people have assigned meaning. The way of getting at what they're talking about is look at it in several languages. I have a small collection of Jabberwocky in other languages where I've come across them. And sometimes they assign different parts of speech to a word, brillig. Just start with word, 'twas brillig is how it starts. In French, it's il brille. It's an impersonal verb instead of an adjective. So that you do get at people trying to assign meaning. And of course, the handicap that Lewis Carroll was a speaker of a language, and it's very difficult to make up a language without being heavily influenced by what you know. So it works both ways, but that's a nice point anyway about it. Jeff?
I was thinking about similar kinds of doublets that have been, exacted in English because of phonological variation. What made me think of it is you were trying to think of a good way to translate copain, and you said pal, but I thought, oh, I know the translation is buddy.
No.
And I thought, wait a minute, what's the etymology of buddy? Well, it's actually a doublet from brother with phonological, so it's baby talk for brother originally.
Oh.
So that's a phonological doublet. And that made me to think of
Yeah.
ain't, which is also a perfectly regular phonological development of am
Am I
not.
not?
And no, that's not so much a doublet, but no, that one
No,
was
that
not
won't
such
work.
that one. But the buddy brother
Buddy
one,
brother is a nice one.
and sister and sis, well no, sissy is a diminutive, but
Mhm.
buddy's a diminutive, but bud is not.
Huh, okay.
And Bob also. Which is
My email is on this, as you think of more junk. Send it my way. Sooner or later, I'm going to pull this all together and do something fully on syntax and meaningfulness, but I'm still working at pieces. And I thank you for what everyone said today, and if you think of other things, write.